We do a lot of web app pen tests, API pen tests, also do red team assessments, things like that, kind of full range of things, right? Recently got my master's degree in information security engineering from SANS, so if anybody has any questions about that MSISE program, feel free to ask. Also, I've got some certifications if you care about that stuff. If you don't, just pretend like I'm a cool kid, okay? So here's the kind of table of contents, what we're going to be talking about today. So whenever we talk about APIs, there's a couple things that go into that too, right? So we're going to talk about the basics of HTTP and then also some basics of APIs so we kind of understand how attacks work, right? So just understanding the attacks is nice, but understanding how things work at, at a fundamental level is really going to help you understand how to hopefully prevent or at least maybe even perform some of these attacks. So we'll also talk about tools you need for this, and then we'll go through the 2019 OWASP API top 10 lists, and then we'll lastly talk about some learning resources. So starting with the basics. Who's familiar with HTTP? Who's used HTTP today? Good. Good. It's good. This is an HTTP request. Does this terrify anybody? Just me? A couple more. Okay, that's fine, right? So this is what, it's kind of hard to see maybe from a distance. I do have these slides up on my LinkedIn and Twitter for a couple days. So act now, if you want to get them. But this is what an HTTP request looks like. Whenever we look at a couple things, that highlighted area there is the HTTP method. You're normally going to see get majority of the time because receiving data. There's also puts, posts, head, which is kind of like just the header of the HTTP headers themselves, not actual data, patch, options, all kinds of other goodies, right? So it's kind of what goes into that. Another section here is the host header, which is going to need to be there on anything, I think, above HTTP 1.1 and higher. And then cookies. Anybody like cookies? Me too. Delicious, right? Even the digital kind. So we'll talk more a little bit about why cookies matter, and how things kind of play into that aspect. But that's kind of an HTTP request. So hopefully, if you throw a request, and something's actively listening, you'll get a response back. So this is what a response looked like. Less terrifying, yes? A couple things to look at here. It's going to reiterate kind of before this underlined area, what, protocol you're running. So this is HTTP 1.1. This is a 200 status, which is okay. Right? It may not say okay, but if you get a 200 status, that's good. There are some other response codes. 100 response codes are like informational. They may tell you info about kind of the response. 200s are good. 300s are usually like redirects. Not necessarily a bad thing, right? But say you go to a page and you need to log in. It may give you a 301 or a 302 to a login portal or redirect page. So 400s, not really that great. Client-side issues. They say client-side. Sometimes like you're not authorized to see content, right, or something like that. 401s, 403s, 404s, file not found, stuff like that. And then 500s, those are fun. We'll actually run into a 500 response later whenever we're talking about an attack, just to kind of show what that may look like in the wild. So another thing, too, sometimes the server will respond with actual valuable information, potentially what process is running or what the application's running. Sometimes this is fake. I've actually ran into one for fun that said it was running on a Commodore 64, which I don't believe. And really at that point as an attacker, I'm like, these people probably aren't messing around defensively, right? Like I'm in a hornet's nest. So another thing too is sometimes if you do like the options header, whenever you send things like the options verb or the method, you'll come back with like allowed methods, right? So the server will tell you, hey, you can use a get, a head, or options. This one was kind of interesting. This actually came back on just a get request. So I wasn't necessarily asking, but the server's like, hey, by the way, here's what we take. So it's kind of looking at HTTP requests and responses, right? So whenever we start talking about APIs, there's a lot of different types of API architectures out there. RESTful and GraphQL are some of the most common ones we run into whenever we're doing testing. So RESTful APIs sometimes are kind of hard to find if you're trying to discover these on your own because they have many different endpoints, right? You may have one for authentication. You could have one for like a user dashboard, like maybe a forum page, posts, kind of items like that. GraphQL, kind of easier to find. It's just one endpoint, so there's a lot of different kind of queries that can go into that. Most of the time it's found at the URI just /GraphQL, which is nice. right? You can find them there. Then you can do like introspection queries or other things to find out what actually works against the API. Some of the older ones we see sometimes. Like we had recently a test come up for a SOAP API, and I'm like, okay, it's been a while. Has anyone ever heard of SOAP before? Oh, that's good. Conferences, it's good to use SOAP before you come. I'm sorry. It's good to use SOAP before you come in, right? So other kind of lesser common ones, some RPC ones, I don't really see these too often nowadays. So whenever we talk about APIs, we want to talk about authentication to APIs. So authentication is the process of verifying an identity, right? It has nothing to do with what you can do with that identity, right? It's just saying who you are. It's like proving who you are, right? So authentication, when we talk about that, is not authorization, not the same. So different kinds of authentication you can see. At the bottom left there, you can see like basic auth, and it may be kind of hard to see, but you'll see at this authorization section here, it's got some crazy base 64 looking font or text. The basic authentication, all it is, the username, :password, base 64 encoded. So you can kind of see that down here. If you echo that back in, base 64 to decode that. This one's a really good username and password. It's just username and password, right? So kind of an example of what that looks like if you see that. So if you actually are able to maybe proxy traffic from a client into yours and you see basic authentication, you may have some credentials to use. Another place sometimes authentication is placed is inside a cookie value, which we talked earlier. Cookies are delicious. But here's one. They don't always have to say, API token. Sometimes they can say just weird things because sometimes developers think they're funny maybe, or they saw something on Google, right? So they paste it in the code. But that's a spot it can go. Sometimes it can also be a custom header on the request. So anytime you see any X header, especially if it says API, it's somewhere good to look at. And then JWTs, JSON Web Tokens, see a lot of these, right? So that's kind of what they look like. Sometimes they're bearer tokens, sometimes they're not. We won't really talk a lot about that since this is an intro class and it's not a ton of time. So we're gonna look at some requests. The request at the top left, you can see it's kind of like to a longer URI. It's like /identity, API, v2, user, dashboard. It's kind of a giveaway that it may be a RESTful API endpoint, And the one at the bottom here, anybody want to guess what that one is? You can see it. GraphQL, right? It's kind of nice. You can see all this craziness down here. These are kind of queries or mutations that you can run against that. But those are kind of what they look like in the wild, right? So if you're using like an intercepting proxy, which we'll talk about in a moment, you can see that. Are you trying to decipher my headers? Don't hack my IPs, okay? These are my IPs. These 192.168. Don't hack them, okay? I trust you. It was on your network. So we're going to talk about some tools that we use to kind of get into this, right? So the first thing you need, probably a good way to look at this, is browsers. You can use Firefox, Edge, or even Chrome, especially now that they're Chromium, But another thing is intercepting proxy, Burp Suite. Anybody know what the logo is at the bottom? Yeah, there you go. You know what that stands for? Good, I forgot. So Z-Attack, no, just kidding. So, no, that's good. It's good stuff. And then the last tool we're going to talk about today is Postman. Anybody use Postman before? I think it's got a cool logo. So I downloaded it and checked it out. But now Zap, so all these screenshots I'm showing you are going to be in Burp Suite. That's what I have. It's what we run. We have enterprise licensing, so it makes sense. But Zap is a great tool to use. So definitely something to use. So whenever we talk about browsers, a helpful browser extension, I just wanted to throw this one out here. Probably everyone's heard of it if you do web application testing or maybe an API testing, is just Foxy Proxy, right? This thing makes managing proxy connections a lot easier. You can just simply go down and select one. This kind of area on the left side shows you one that's been created, right? So you can send a request through Burp or through Postman, whatever you want to set up. I even color code them. Something I like to do too is sometimes you'll test an API or maybe even a site that has like multiple authentications, right? Like you've got a user and then an admin level. I may set up different browser profiles to point to different ports. Kind of helps out. The slide on the part on the right just shows you kind of what a new one looks like, right? So we're going to call this one Burp. It's going to be running on port 8080 on another IP I don't want you to hack. It's my home network, right? So 127.0.0.1, pointing back to myself, right? So whenever you set up a kind of like a proxy, right? The whole point of that is to intercept that the traffic or to be able to look at this traffic. So this is what it'll look like when you first turned it on. I'm going to tell you, it's not as condensed as this normally. I had to like try to fit everything in a screenshot, so it looks atrocious, probably worse than it would in a real environment, not outside of like, 20 by 20 pixels almost, right? But this is kind of what it looks like. This highlighted, actually it's not on this one. This is what it looks like whenever you send a request, right? By default, it's going to intercept the requests, and then you can manipulate that if you need to, or send that on, or just turn off interception entirely, and it'll kind of run through and show up in the HTTP history. And that's what we're talking about now, right? So as you use, the browser, whatever you're using to interact with these objects, items will show up in your proxy history. Again, this is kind of like a condensed view. You can see the number. There's like 1,067 kind of requests in there. It's not always, it's not that small, right? You don't want to make it that small, but it's hard to kind of show kind of how this looks for someone that hasn't seen Burp Suite before. So some of the cool features with Burp Suite, and this is your comparable features in Zap. Like I said, I'm just going through Burp because it's what we use. Repeater. Repeaters, really, I use it mainly for manual payload testing. If I want to test this one thing, right, or maybe I have a couple things I want to do, I'll manually manipulate those and run through. And how you get to that is in this back screen here. I would just right-click on one of these requests and then send a repeater or send an intruder. So repeater I use for kind of standard one-off manual testing. If I want to do like maybe test against a whole list of items especially for like injection testing, I'll use intruder for that. Find the location I want to specify, which this one automatically grabbed this cookie, and then we kind of go from there. I did want to point out some helpful kind of extender functionality. So Burp Suite Extender is kind of like an extension suite. I'm gonna get a drink real quick. Sorry, I normally sit in an office by myself all day, so it's hard to talk to myself, but not normally this much, right? So I get a little dry. So whenever we're looking at Burp Suite Extender functionality, some helpful Burp extensions here. One I really like is AutoRise. This helps automate authorization testing, right? So you can send requests with like API headers or cookie values for certain user accounts, and then you can kind of set it against like another credential, right? And kind of as you're running through the application, it'll automatically check against that. So you may have one set of credentials that's for admin functionality, and one's for just basic user functionality. And if you set it against the other, it's kind of nice to see what you should or should not see. So it's very helpful for researching or for searching for IDORs or BOLAs. We'll talk about those here in a moment. Those are not diseases, by the way. Those are acronyms. Another helpful one is NQL. It's a GraphQL scanner. Really helpful for like finding queries, mutations, and subscriptions. It automatically does like introspection queries to see what the server will accept. And so that's helpful for me. Another one too is JSON Web Tokens, and it automatically will flag JWTs that are found in requests or responses. And it also has a JWT editor. You can check with signatures because sometimes there may be authorization or authentication issues there, which we won't really go into here just due to time, but something to keep in mind. So who's used Postman before? Nice, good. So this is kind of, whenever you open up Postman, there's different things you can create. You can create just HTTP requests, basic HTTP requests. Like if you've got the structure, you can kind of post them in there. You can also kind of proxy stuff through this to pull requests for you, which is nice. The thing I use a lot is the environment variables and collections, which we'll talk about. Environment variables are nice because they work across the whole, your whole collection that you have set up, right? So a collection is really all your requests for one thing. So if I'm looking to test a website or test an API, I'm going to have like it set up for a whole collection. I'll have everything in there. If something changes, because sometimes if we do tests, we may not test in like a production environment. We'll test like a beta, or user like acceptance environment. So those URLs may change, as the infrastructure comes up and down. So it's kind of nice to be able to change those environmental variables. This is kind of what a Postman collection looks like. So if you look on the left side, it's the collection-wide authentication, right? So it's got the information there. And you can have, different types of authentication you can pour there. And then at the bottom right, it's where the collection-wide variables come into play. So sometimes if you've got like a custom header that you need to add on there to make it work properly, you can set that there. So it'll automatically update that throughout your collection. This is my favorite feature, is the import functionality. Normally, if we're testing an API, I'm hoping that They have good documentation for testing this thoroughly, right? So we can provide this. Another thing too is hopefully they have like maybe a Postman collection for me to import, so I already have everything ready to go, or even like Swagger documentation. So super helpful. If you got a couple different options, you can import this from like a file, like if there's a collection or Swagger document, you can pull from, even folders, links. Another one too is you can post from like a Kroll command too, right? So you can do that with the raw text feature. It's kind of nice to see. Again, my personal favorite because saves a lot of time, right? Sometimes whenever you're paying a pen test, time is what you're paying for, right? So being able to have this information lets you get kind of deeper into the API itself instead of spending some of that on documentation. So here's what Postman will look like for you whenever you have a collection going. If you look on the left side, it's kind of where the collection is. You can see this one is named tests, and there's just different kind of structure and folders in there. You can see this one's a post request. There's some gets, some other values down here. You also see at the top, that's where the base URL, that's an environmental variable. You can change that, in your collection and your environmental variables and have that all working, and kind of makes it easier, like I said, to kind of update that if you need to during an assessment or during a test. Another thing I like to use is the Postman proxy. So I like to send things to Burp, so I have them kind of all centralized, or Burp or into Zap. So if you turn this on, you can easily proxy this information into into something else, right? So Burp or Zap. It's helpful also if you have network constraints. Sometimes we'll test maybe like in a client's environment and we can't access certain networks without proxying through something. So it's the only way we're going to be able to test, right, from where we're sitting. So now that we know a little bit about the basics, who wants to look at some fun stuff? Yeah? All right, well, I'm sorry, there's no fun stuff. Just vulnerabilities here, which are not fun at all. It depends on what side you're on, right? It's fun for me. It may not be fun if you're trying to defend these. So this is a list of the OWASP API top 10 from 2019. The current lists, there's a current revision of this going on now. They're accepting information for or documentation. So I don't know when that'll be updated. For all I know, it could have been updated yesterday. I didn't check, so this could be really old info. But this is kind of what we're going to go through. We're going to go through every one of these items and look kind of what a request looks like, what to test, and kind of what to look for. So first one, broken object level access. This is what we referred to earlier as a BOLA, right? So if anybody does web testing, you may have seen IDOR, like insecure direct object reference there. It's kind of synonymous, right? It's kind of funny. Sometimes it depends on who you talk to. You can tell what they test mostly. It's like, oh, that's a BOLA. Oh, you're an API, test a lot of APIs. So a lot of the times clients don't care, right? They just kind of want to know what the information is, but it's good to know. So basically, a broken object level access, this allows an API consumer, which is maybe the user of the API, access to unauthorized resources. So in this request here, you can see we're looking at a workshop / API / mechanic report, kind of long-winded, right? Report ID number 5. So if that's your account and you can access that, that's fine. But maybe what I would try to do as a tester is try to, especially if it's an easy number like that, maybe try the next number. Maybe try number 6. Maybe try number 1. Maybe try a negative number. See what explodes, right? So it's kind of fun to do. So that's what you're going to look at, right? You're going to look for potential IDs or numbers to look at, maybe something you shouldn't have access to. And then especially if they're guessable or kind of sequential in number, it's a little easier. So really what you want to do is look to access data that you shouldn't. So this example here, this is a response of someone else's kind of report ID. So obviously I've got the VIN number for their car, so I can hack their car completely now with the VIN number, right? Is that how that works? But it's information I shouldn't have. The second one is broken user authentication. This is going to be anything to do with the authentication process at all, right? So this one's a little different. I didn't have a really good example, so kind of follow me on this one. So whenever you're testing, you want to look for any authentication bypass. So this one specifically is like a one-time password or one-time passcode, like an OTP, MFA kind of code. So I say here, sometimes this can come from interesting or hint older places, right? So if we look here, we can see that we're looking at identity / API / auth / version 3. And then we have a username, right? This is robot001 at example.com and an awesome password of password1. But unfortunately, it comes to like a code check, right? So maybe there's an MFA, it emails the user. I don't have access to that user's email. What am I going to do, right? So there's 4 digits, 10,000 possibilities, something like that. So maybe you want to try to brute force those. So we try to brute force those. Unfortunately, status 503. You've exceeded the number of attempts. It's really unfortunate. So it makes like brute forcing a lot harder to do, right? Because you've got this, potential here, but sometimes it's throttling, and we'll get into this here in a little bit. We'll talk more about this, but sometimes the throttling could be kind of low, so you may just send 10, 15 requests, and it's like, hey, you need to slow down. And that's going to be really hard, especially if you try to log in again, or the code's time-based, right? You've only got a certain amount of time to guess this code. So that makes it tough. So kind of what would you do? So we will go back to the original request. And what we're going to do is, on this one, let's say version 2 may be in scope 2, right? So we just change that number v3 to v2. And maybe they didn't have like rate limiting established in the older version. It's possible, right? Especially if you have older versions still available. So we change that to version 2. We run the test. Oh, look at that. It works. And a 200 code means what? Okay, right? We're good. So that's good. Then you got into that account. So that's an example of kind of like a broken user authentication. One of many examples, right? There's tons of them. Anything related to user authentication, not necessarily MFA bypasses, but something to keep in mind. So another one, see quite a bit, excessive data exposure. So an API, basically here, it's going to respond with too much information. So here we're going to make a request to community API2, so it's like kind of to a recent post forum, This call's been made in the back end, but if we look at the actual response, look at all this extra data. We got the title of the post, which is probably good, then the content, that's fine, the nickname of the person. Do we need their email, right? Do we need this other information? Do we need vehicle ID? Do we need things like this? Probably not, right? Especially if we're just looking at forums. So really what you're going to look for whenever you're testing this, you're going to look for any responses with excessive information. So if you find information you don't need, that could be vulnerable to that, right? And some companies have different kind of risk tolerances for this, right? So obviously if it's, sensitive information, they may not care if it's, a VIN number, or some vehicle ID, but if it's someone's, social security number, they hopefully should care, right? So something to look at. So really what you're going to ask yourself is this data in this response relevant to what I asked? So a lot of the times what the apps will do is they'll kind of strip that data out. They won't like replay that or display that in the application, right? But it comes in the response. So something you're looking at to see if there's just excessive data. So lack of resources or rate limiting. I want to tell you, I'll get to this in a second. So basically, you do not throttle requests appropriately, right? A lot of APIs, companies monetize their APIs, so maybe they can't do over 100 API requests in an hour, maybe something like that, maybe 1,000 a week or something like that. That's obviously not implemented correctly. That's going to be an issue. It's going to cost them money, so they may care, right? But also something I want to tell you, this can lead to denial of service. This, like I said, can also bypass API monetization, like we talked about. But the denial of service, so I was testing a client once, and I asked them if I could do rate limiting checks, and they're like, yeah, it's fine. Check whatever you want. I was like, okay, whatever I want, that's great. And so what I did was, right, so they used AWS, and I threw tons of packets. I think I was throwing like 10,000 requests per second. I had a beef machine, and it looked cool. It was just flying, and it never went down. And I did this for maybe 30 minutes. And I'm like, that's enough. It's had enough. And then I stopped it. Service was still available. I never got any 500 errors, right? I never got any too many tries, too much data entry. And I was like, so I talked to him. I was like, hey, nothing went down. But it also didn't throttle me. And they're like, oh, okay, well, let's check on the back end. They had an auto scaling group set up in their AWS environment, right? And so, yeah, they had a pretty hefty bill. But luckily, they at least found that out during testing, right? So for those that don't know, auto-scaling groups, as need, it depends on how they set it up, right? But so potentially, if over 80% of a server's utilization is triggered, it's going to spin up more boxes, right, or more instances. So they didn't ever tell me how many instances there was, but they're like, yeah, hold on, we'll call you right back. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay, you better, right? And so anyway, we then proceeded. But I just want to let you know, if you're going to test this, test it on your own stuff all you want, right? But make sure that AWS bill, they will make you pay it, right? Or maybe, but yeah, it's just one of those things, right? So what I'll do if I test this, we obviously want to make sure it's in scope, because especially if it's a production environment, not all clients have production and tests, alpha, beta, gamma stuff. So just make sure that they're okay with you maybe taking their stuff down. And I try to like tell them now, you know, like for sure, hey, I'm going to do this type of testing over the next 20 minutes. Call me, you know, if something goes wrong. And normally it's good. People have this stuff set up. But it's something to keep in mind, especially if you're paying that cloud service bill, right? You don't want that to blow up on you. So this is what it'll look like, maybe if it's implemented correctly. You know, a 429, too many requests. So that's okay. But like I said, again, make sure this is in scope before testing, please. I will not pay your AWS bill or any other cloud service provider bill. So use as intended. Really what you're going to do, though, is just look for anything, like we showed earlier, 500 response, right? So 429s, things like that. That's going to help to know. And also, all these services are different, too, right? They all scale. So it depends on what they're trying to sell, what they're trying to use it for. So maybe 1,000 requests in a minute may not be a problem for a larger company, right? But for a smaller company, that could totally shut them down. So it's something to keep in mind when you look at this. But it's a big issue. Broken function level authorization. So this is like, it's kind of like priv-esque, but it's not necessarily like vertical, right? Could be lateral too. It's like you're using another function outside of your privilege level group, right? So if you're a normal user account, you shouldn't be able to do admin functionality. Pretty basic, right? Or if you're in finance, maybe you shouldn't also, you know, be in marketing or so, you know, that kind of thing, right? So kind of think of it that way. So it can be, like I said, lateral or vertical. This is related to authorization, right? Not authentication. This is related to directly what you have access to or shouldn't have access to. So you see the original request went to a user/dashboard API endpoint, and the modified request goes to /admin/dashboard. So really you're going to look at the proxy's HTTP history for potential interesting kind of URLs or endpoints to look at, and then maybe use some sort of word list for this too. Maybe it's not admin, maybe it's dev, right? Dev1, test1, something like that, and to see what comes up. If you access something you shouldn't, then that's something you need to look at. Mass assignment. It's kind of a weird name for one. But this is where the server accepts additional parameters without sanitization or filtering those parameters. All right, so what does that mean, right? So let's say we're looking at the request. Bless you. We're looking at the request, and here's what the original request looks like, and there's what the original response looks like. It may be hard to see. So in the original request, we have like an ID of 2, we have a quantity of 1, and the status is return pending. So if anybody's guessing, what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to try to send something back to a company, and I want it to show as return so I get my money back, but I may want to keep the item, right? I mean, I obviously wouldn't do that. Are we recording? We're recording. I'm not going to do that at all. At all. Scout's honor. But that's kind of what the process is here, right? So you're looking here? Yeah.
Would this include attacks like, say, the billion laugh attack of XML?
So what kind of attack?
Like a billion laughs, like where you're embedding lots of XML that's recursive.
It could. So the question was, would this kind of coverage here or vulnerability cover the billion laughs attack? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. So it could. It really depends on, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, is kind of what the server accepts is valid parameters, right? So sometimes, like this application here, you can see you're actually setting it yourself. It's not like a server-side set, right? Like, so you're setting this as a client, like, yeah, return pending, okay. So, and you see in the response, it says return or status, return pending. But I really want that money back, and I really want this item. So what I would do is I would resend that request with that same parameter, but turn it to returned. And then watch the money come back in my bank account as the response also says returned, right? I wish I would have learned, never mind, I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, like I said, use at your own risk, right? Within permission. This is a big deal, like for shopping portals, though, or things like that. Obviously, if a company's looking to make money on this, this is something that has validity, as far as testing. So kind of strange, right? But what you're really looking for is any unexpected values and see if you can rechange those. So you may have to run these through. Sometimes I'll make like maybe a custom word list of different possible statuses for items and then run those through with like a intruder, to see if anything triggers, see if anything actually changes on the back end. But it's interesting to see. Yeah?
Does this also include adding attributes to it?
So does this include adding attributes? It could. It could. It could. So that's another possibility for like authentication bypass, right? Like whenever you make an account, you may be able to, on like the post request to create the account, you may be able to put is admin equals true, right? It depends. I'm going to call it a vulnerability, and I'm going to call it a critical vulnerability, right? And that's what the client cares about, right, at the end of the day, right? But I would probably call it both. It's that one specifically. That one instance would be due to, like, user authentication bypass. So that, but I would sign to both, because that's something that needs to get fixed on the back end. Because what a developer may do is you run that, and they're like, oh, yeah, we'll fix that. We'll take out that is admin, but other ones work, right? So you want to fix it fully. Yeah. So the question is, have I found any good password repos? You're talking about like not password repos, but repos for these types of word lists? Yeah. There are specific API word lists. There are some. Yeah, so there are some good lists out there. One of them is like, I think the asset note list. I think it's common word list 2 maybe from asset notes, a good one. There's also some in Kite Runner, which is more of an API discovery kind of. But there's some of the kites that are in there, have some good lists in there. But yeah, good question. Oh, I went ahead too far. I got trigger happy. I'm sorry. Now we're on security misconfiguration. So this is kind of run of the gambit stuff, right? It's not just, it's kind of like authentication. Any authentication issue is going to come back to, authentication issues. Any other security misconfigurations will be kind of lumped in here, right? So you're going to look for things like verbose error messages. Like sometimes you may put like, let's say a weird parameter or weird like keyboard input into a parameter, and it'll throw back to you, a stack trace error, and it's got the full list of, where the program's running on the server. Weird things happen. So something to look at there. That's possibility one. Sometimes unnecessary HTTP methods, like if it shouldn't be a post, but it accepts posts, that could be an issue. Then other things too, but kind of lead to different types of attacks, right? So sometimes in this example, we're looking at, it tells us what version, what application is running, right? This may be accurate, it may not be accurate. It depends on, sometimes if I'm looking at this, if I look at the kind of the maturity of the organization security-wise, I can tell if this is real or not for the most part, right? And then you kind of go on that. So what you do is then go on here, see if there's any vulnerabilities for this. So then you're also going to look for any kind of missing security headers or anything like that for like ones that say like X powered by, they're really proud of their software, so they'll let you know exactly what version they're running, stuff like that, which is cool, but it's really cool for me too, especially if there's a, new 0 day or something, right, that just came out for it. Injection attacks, those are fun, right? This is where the kind of the fun comes. So this happens when like the provider, like the API application itself doesn't perform input sanitization, so it's going to accept kind of whatever you throw at it. It's not a good practice. It's good, especially I would recommend if you're running an API and you accept input, like if you accept like 10 different commands, make sure those only work, right? Like mock out like URL encoding those characters, other weird stuff that can happen. But in this example here, this one covers like SQL, NoSQL, command injection, XML injection, all that kind of stuff. But as we're looking at here, this is an example. We're going to show this as a NoSQL example. So I use this one a lot. I'll try to fake coupon codes. Actually, I don't use this one at all. I'm sorry. I never use this one. Gosh, I keep getting myself. No, this is something you can try, right? So for this website, you go use fake coupon code, which is not real, right? We get a response of 500 internal server error. So that lets me know that's probably not a real coupon code. Right, so maybe an example to bypass this. Oh, hold on. First, I get all excited about the bypass, right? So whenever you're looking at testing this, you're going to want to look for parameters that can be tested or fuzzed, right? So anything that takes input, like this one, you want to test or fuzz this, like you're talking about looking through some of the fuzz lists, some of the words lists. And so a lot of the time, some of the standard web hacking stuff applies here, word list wise, sometimes for injection stuff anyway. So, and then last thing you're going to do is you're going to test and fuzz them, and then you got a creepy little smiley face, because that's what you want to do. But this example here, right? So fake coupon code didn't work. So now we're going to try to do not equals fake coupon code, right? So yeah, fake coupon code doesn't work. That's fine. So what if it doesn't? What if it's not fake coupon code? And this thing says, yeah, it's not fake coupon code, but here's 75% off, which is great. I've got teenagers. I'm married. This is helpful for me, right? I mean, hypothetically, right? Hypothetically, of course. But that's kind of how that works, right? And then if you wanted to scale this beyond this, maybe you could say like not equals fake coupon code and track 075 or just track 075 and see what else is out there. Obviously, this is for coupon codes. This is part of one of the environments I'll show you guys at the end. You can kind of download and play with, but just kind of think of how this could work outside of this, right? And how an attacker could utilize this. Improper asset assignment or management. So sometimes we run into this, like let's say we're supposed to be testing version 3. We kind of ran into this earlier, but it wasn't necessarily, improper because version 2 may still be around. But we're going to look for maybe a dev environment, maybe an older version that doesn't have security controls on there. So sometimes older versions, as time progresses, if they find issues, hopefully they get fixed, right? So version 4 may be more secure than version 3. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to look for, like in this instance, version 3, maybe a retired version that shouldn't be around, is version 2. So you go in there and look from there. Version 1, version 2, version 3, dev, it's kind of all good examples to use when looking for these kind of endpoints. And these are more so for RESTful API endpoints since there's so many of them. But sometimes if you have different versions that you find, you want to test those for like some of these missing security functionality, like we talked about earlier with the MFA bypass, right? That worked on an older version. Also, if in scope, right? So some companies, like if you get tested, or if you get paid to test version 3, if you touch version 2, that's not a good thing, right? So obviously make sure that's covered. And the last one is the coolest one of all, insufficient logging and monitoring. Who wants to talk about that, right? It's important. It really is. So this is something, it's kind of hard to test from an attacker standpoint. So sometimes, like I don't necessarily want in their log environment, and they won't let me anyway, but something we can look at. Basically, if it doesn't produce logs, or like it's an insufficient logging level, like it only logs critical, alerts or whatever it finds, or log messages do not include enough detail, like, hey, a critical alert happened. What is it, right? Sometimes it may not be there. That would be vulnerable here. So another thing too, some people don't think about is log integrity. So your logs are being kept, things are looking okay, but can someone edit those logs? If they can edit the logs, then you can't trust your logs potentially, right? So something to look at. Logs are not continuously monitored. I've actually seen a company only log things while their staff was in the office. So it's like whatever on the weekend, hey, that's somebody else's problem, right? And I get it. Listen, I get it. I've done blue team stuff. I don't want to look at them either, right? Especially if I come in with 5,000 alerts. I'm like, yeah, nothing happened, clear, right? So anyway, API infrastructure is not continuously monitored. It's another issue. So maybe like the API endpoint maybe, but like the server hosting it isn't. Maybe the network isn't. So things like that. So another item too, whenever you're testing this, you want to check if log review is part of the scope of the assessment. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes they may just, like you may ask for screenshots. Hey, show me where this is logged, right? So you have something for your report, something to show kind of they're doing their due diligence. So that's something to keep in mind. So last thing, learning resources. This is not a complete list of anything at all. There are so many resources. But obviously we talked about Burp Suite. We talked about OWASP Zap. We talked about Postman. So those are good tools to look at. I would highly recommend Bookwise, the Hacking API book by Corey Ball. I think that came out this year. It's been a long year, but it's a good book. Another one, this Black Hat GraphQL. I have not read it yet. It comes out in, I think, February, but if you pre-order, you can get like the digital early access, I think, through No Starch Press. So online resources, obviously we talked about OWASP and this awesome API security repo here. And again, these slides are on my LinkedIn and Twitter, so feel free to download them, but it's got tons of more resources. AppySec University, this is a kind of a recent launch by, I don't know if it's by Corey Ball, but I know he's associated with it. And it's got cool stuff. It's got actual video lab environments. I think there's a certification you can get to if you're interested. But some of the vulnerable VMs or platforms that we kind of used during this presentation, one is Crappy, Pixie, an old Juice Shop, vulnerable GraphQL application, damn vulnerable GraphQL, and continue on from there. Tons of resources to learn. Obviously try HackMe, Hack the Box, other things like that too. But I would encourage, if you want to get into this stuff, get some of these resources, start reading, look through these attacks, see how things work. Download some of these to your home lab or your machine, maybe your neighbor's machine, if they got open Wi-Fi. Just kidding. And then kind of go from there, right? And that's it.
Real quick, the food truck just pulled up. Give them 15 minutes and they should
Thank you. All right, any questions? Yes. What's the worst API I've seen? I've seen some. I swear I thought the client was testing to see if we do things, right? You know what I'm saying? It's almost like if you download one of these vulnerable VMs, you know, or these vulnerable architectures, it's like it's hitting off every one. It's like they put Juice Shop on their website with actual products. And I'm like, what did we get? Are they paying us for this? Is this free practice, right? Let's get some interns on this, you know, to get this up. But I've seen that in real world. I can't say what company, obviously, but like companies that you would think like, oh dear God, why? You know, it happens, right? And it's really hard too because you can't blame the company because sometimes they're so large, right? You have all these teams and all these different groups doing everything. I understand that, but yeah, it was interesting because I really asked my supervisor, I'm like, hey, is this real? Like, and they're like, yeah, that's real. I'm like, okay. Well, it's like, so the write-up, that's the worst part. So finding cool stuff is great, but the write-ups, like, now I got to write all this stuff up. You know, it's like 100-page or something. It was a monster. Yeah.
Have you had engagements where they gave you scope of just like domains, but not the actual API endpoints, where you had to fuzz and find them yourself? And if so, what have you used to be able to fuzz and find APIs doing recon?
Good question. So that question was if they give us kind of a loose scope, right? Or here's our domain, see what we can find inside there. That happens, right? So sometimes there's passive ways to do that, right? To look for things. I'm more of an active approach. So I like to use, like I mentioned, Kite Runner earlier. It's a good tool to do that. You can also kind of brute force some of the possible endpoints with like GoBuster, Durbuster, things like that too. But sometimes just using the website too. If you use it with like, there's a man-in-the-middle web proxy you can use. And it kind of runs in the background and you're surfing the site. And as you're doing that, you can kind of see what URLs are being called in the background, right? So you can use that through like developer tools too, like, you know, the forbidden hacker tool F12. You know, you can do that and kind of look at your console or network connections and see what APIs are being called out. And so what we'll do is write those down. And we always like to verify too, because you know how it goes, right? Especially some companies like this group's paying for this, so we can't really, you know, like if we find something that may not be in that group, they don't want us to do, maybe out of scope. But always like to verify. But good question. Yeah.
I know a lot of words to say we want to test against with logging and monitoring being part of the API top 10. Like,
Yeah.
how do you evaluate that?
So evaluating, logging, and monitoring, that's usually what we do, right? So if we have access, sometimes, depends on the company, they may give us access. Like if they're in a cloud provider, they may give us read-only access to where their logs are stored, right? If they store them in an S3 bucket or something, right? Or something like that. Sometimes we'll just say, since we don't have access, show us what you're doing. And it's just, we'll document that. I usually document that accordingly because I want to trust them, but it's trust but verify, right? It's a big deal. So that's what we'll do. We'll say like the client provided us this, showing their logging environment in these settings. Who knows if it's, I don't know if it's the actual environment, you know, because I can't see that, right? But I'm taking their word. And hopefully, you know, that's what we're looking for. Do you have a question? Yeah. So for reports, I like to not do reports. Now, actually, I don't mind reporting. I report as I hack stuff because the one thing I think I hate about myself is when I didn't do that, right? So I come down to the end of an engagement, I'm like, oh yeah, the report. And then I'm like, oh God, I haven't done anything. I'm looking at this blank Word doc, right? So I've used different tools. I've used like PlexTrack, right? I've used Dratus, Method, just good old-fashioned Word docs. It just depends. Some clients, too, they may have specific ways, right, like templates they kind of want us to use. It depends, because some of them may ingest that into their vulnerability management solutions, stuff like that. So good question, though. Yeah?
So let's say you do, like you can see that the client is sending a request to the log and you're able to mess with it. You would report on that?
Yes. So the question was, if we see that like a query is going to the logs, we see that, we can report on that? Yeah. Oh, yeah, we can. Sometimes there's certain things, too, kind of mainly with, it kind of blends into web app stuff, too, right? But if a client is, I have seen items pop up in like a SIM console, like a management console, right? Like a log console, from what we've inputted into a header, right? So if you put like maybe a cross-site scripting payload inside of a, you know, something that's going to be logged and you log into the logging solution, boom. You know, you pop up. We may or may not have gotten credentials that way before too. May or may not. Can't clarify. Yeah.
If you're enforcing methods or doing content negotiation, should you return a 405 and 406 or a general error?
So if we're enforcing content, right? I like general errors. It's like the same thing with login for me, right? Like if I'm going to try to log into a website, and I try to use a password or username that I've gathered from somebody, and it says, oh, that account exists but the wrong password. That's too much information for me, right? That may fall into like verbose error messages for me, but I'll let you know. Obviously, it's a developer decision. Some places are okay with that. It just depends. Good question, though. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, you're going to test my hearing. Hold on.
Have you ever seen an API that, say, once you start poking at it, suddenly black holes your traffic?
Have I ever seen an API that black holes my traffic once I start poking at it? Yes. Yeah. Mostly it's like a WAF or something, in the front of it. But our thing is whenever I want to test something, if I'm going to test if they know we're testing, right, it's not some kind of red team covert testing. I want to be able to get past that firewall, right? Because there's always going to be bypass for firewall. There's always a possibility, right? Or maybe from a different vector. Maybe someone's inside, they're able to attack this, and those, they're not going through the firewall, right? So normally whenever we're trying to do API testing, I want to test as close to that API as I can. But it's a good question. It's valid. Some clients will have us do that just to prove that it's working. Sometimes it comes back in the form of the rate limiting. Like if we're throwing too much at it, or if we start throwing two different types of payloads at it, it may blacklist us for a while, or blocklist us. Good question. Yeah.
So I know you talked about how you're given domains with scope and domains. That sounds similar to black box testing.
Yep.
I was curious if you find a lot of that.
Yeah, no, they want to. So that's the kicker. It's always like what do you want out of this, right? Some companies will want kind of like a closed box approach, right, where they don't give us any data. That's more realistic, possibly, like to an attacker. But for me, I'm more. The more information you give me, the more information I can help you with, right? So let's say an attacker has a lot more time to work on this company than I do, right? Because they're paying me for a set amount of time. If I hate this company, I'm going to do it forever, right? Or whatever, right? Or if a malicious actor, right? So it's something to keep in mind. But I'm more of a fan of kind of the more information we can get, the more we can help you out. But some companies don't care about that, and that's fine. I mean, we can do whatever. But we'll also usually report on that too, or notate that, that we couldn't provide this, or we couldn't gather this information, because of these reasons, But it's good to know. And we have clients that do both. So, good question. Any other ones? Food trucks are almost here, I think. Okay. Hey, listen, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, the slides are available because sometimes if you're new to this stuff, especially it's like drinking from a fire hose, right? So feel free to download them. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, okay? Thank you.